A private investigator revealed a shocking video of my wife's infidelity, leading me to seek revenge and order DNA tests. I now find myself in a scenario I used to only see in YouTube videos about cheating. I used to watch those clips for amusement, never imagining I'd be in such a situation myself. It all started when I received a peculiar envelope in the mail. What stood out was that there was no return address, and it had two stamps in the top right corner. The handwritten address made me suspect it was from an old military buddy trying to reconnect. When I opened it, the letter was addressed to Mr. Unknown, which is the placeholder I'll use for my name. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Unknown, I'm writing you this anonymous letter to inform you that your wife is having an affair with Mr. Bossman, who is involved with multiple women." I read the letter several times. The sender wished to remain anonymous, but clearly wanted me to know that my wife was cheating with her manager. The mention of multiple women implied he wasn't just seeing my wife. I had seen her supervisor once when I dropped her off at work. He was a tall man, around 6'4" or 6'5", bald, not particularly attractive, and out of shape. He resembled a bulkier golem. I knew my wife's type, and he wasn't it. For context, during my military service, I focused on endurance training. About 6 months before I left, I started lifting weights to combat workout fatigue. I put on 20 pounds of muscle, and while it might sound arrogant, my appearance improved noticeably. Even though I stood 5'9", I never thought of myself as a ladies' man. However, with my new physique, I received more attention from women. Some discreetly checked me out, and one of my wife's friends even hinted at being interested. My wife, who tends to be jealous, never seemed to pick up on this. Being religious, I never took advantage of these moments or used them to boost my ego. I didn't flirt or cheat. It simply gave me a bit more confidence. Her only comment was, "If your neck disappears, it's time to stop," which was underwhelming but made me believe she cared for who I was, not how I looked. Thinking about the letter, I was cautious since it lacked solid proof. Confronting her wouldn't help. If she denied it, what could I do? Without evidence, if she wasn't cheating, my suspicion would just make her feel I didn't trust her. Accusing her could drive any potential affair deeper underground. I needed proof. For some background, I'm 35 and my wife is 33. We met in college and got married shortly afterward. I then enlisted in the military. We have 3 children, a 9-year-old son and 2 daughters, aged 7 and 5. My wife stayed home to care for them. I believe she remained faithful during my deployments, and we had a strong circle of friends who supported her while I was away. Unlike the stereotype of spouses cheating during deployments, it's hard to hide such things, though it does happen. In summary, I was rarely home during my final assignment. As I advanced in rank, my absences would only increase. So after 10 years, I decided to leave the military. This is a crucial point in a military career since it doesn't make financial sense to leave after 10 years. Orders typically last 3 years, and retirement comes after 20. My main reason for leaving was to be more involved with my children, as I hadn't spent much time with them or even changed a diaper. My wife wasn't happy with my decision. She doesn't handle uncertainty well and felt secure in our military life, even though she often complained about my absences. After I left, she gave me a detailed list of demands about where we should live, how much I should earn, and other conditions to keep her and the kids secure. She cried a lot during this time. Job opportunities dictate location, but I met her requirements. We were lucky. I got a job in the right state, near my parents, whom she loves. I earned what would be considered a high salary for a former soldier, in the 6 figures. We moved to an area with excellent public schools, low HOA fees, and friendly neighbors. My wife had always complained that frequent relocations prevented her from starting her career. She wanted to use her degree in logistics and supply chain management. Within 3 months, she found her ideal job at a distribution center. All her coworkers were women, and their supervisor was the bald man I mentioned. The job didn't pay much, but it was the position she'd always wanted since graduating, and I fully supported her. Since getting the letter, I've been trying to gather evidence to verify its claims. If someone wanted to expose her boss, why not report it to HR? Why tell me instead? Despite my questions, I began closely observing my wife. I knew her phone password, so I checked her messages. I found some texts between my wife and her boss, but their exchanges seemed normal, and they rarely communicated that way. The letter haunted me for about a week, yet I couldn't find any proof of her cheating. She'd been at her new job for 5 months, and the only thing that had noticeably changed was our intimacy. For the past 2 months, she'd been rejecting my advances, but I couldn't accuse her of infidelity based solely on that. She often cited stress from work or exhaustion as reasons. After 2 weeks of searching for evidence and coming up empty, I stayed alert for any clues. I often wondered who sent that letter and thought it might have been a prank. At one point, I nearly joked about it with my wife, but I decided against it. I was ready to move past it and accept that things in our relationship might not return to how they once were. Then, one night, while she was talking about work, she mentioned her female colleagues envied the attention she got from her boss. She explained that they were jealous because she'd earned the best quarterly reviews and had been named Employee of the Month 3 times, all within a short period. She was genuinely thrilled about the recognition, and at first I was happy for her since this was her first real job. But the letter kept nagging at me. Why were her coworkers so envious of her? Could one of them have sent the letter out of jealousy? And if so, why would they go that far? The thought reawakened my suspicion, and I considered hiring a private investigator to follow her. However, I hesitated at the last minute because I didn't want to spend money if I was wrong. Without solid evidence, my suspicions seemed baseless. Everything, her reduced interest in intimacy and her enthusiasm for her job, appeared fairly normal. Instead, I decided to buy a GPS tracker online and install it in her car to monitor her movements. The tracker I chose fit into the OBD 2 port beneath the steering wheel. I was nervous about how visible it was, but since my wife wasn't very tech-savvy, I figured she wouldn't notice. If she did, I could easily explain it away as a part of routine car maintenance, something she trusted me with. I wouldn't recommend this type of GPS tracker for a covert operation like this, but it was what I had. It was Friday, and I was eager to see what the GPS might reveal. Around lunchtime, I saw that her car was parked in an unfamiliar area. It wasn't near her workplace, the grocery store, or our kids' school. The location was across town, in an area we rarely visited. I Googled the address and found out it was a hotel. I quickly asked my boss if I could leave work early and drove toward the GPS location, which was 35 miles away. About 25 miles into my trip, with 10 miles left, I noticed the GPS signal moving away from the hotel. I tracked it using an app on my phone and sped up, but the signal was already heading back toward her workplace. Her car had been at that location for about 2 to 3 hours, and I had just missed her. I felt a wave of disappointment. I parked and looked around to see if her car had been at the Best Western Hotel or the nearby restaurant. It crossed my mind that she might have been out for lunch with her colleagues since the hotel and restaurant were adjacent. But it didn't make sense for her to drive that far when plenty of restaurants were closer to her work. She wasn't the type to go out of her way for Golden Corral, especially not 27 miles. I returned home with more questions than answers. My wife noticed I was troubled, but I lied and said I'd had a rough day at work. I didn't confront her because I still didn't have enough evidence. Finally, I decided to hire a private investigator. I couldn't keep checking my phone and leaving work to chase her down. On Saturday, I found an investigator who charged $25 per hour. He wasn't licensed but had a good camera phone, and I found him on Craigslist. He agreed to follow her during her lunch breaks. His rates were affordable since he only worked a few hours a day. He also installed a GPS tracking app on his phone, letting him see the same data I did. I informed him about the Best Western incident and showed him the location. Monday through Thursday, everything was routine. But on Friday, he notified me of some movement. He texted to say my wife was driving toward the Best Western and he was following her. I opened the app to double-check. Knowing where she was headed, he got there before she did. When my wife arrived, she entered the hotel alone. The investigator took pictures of her going inside and followed her. He knew what her boss looked like because I had described him and his car. The investigator waited in the lobby and discreetly recorded my wife as she got into the elevator. He managed to get in the elevator with her, which was risky, as she could have recognized him if she'd seen him before. I guess you get what you pay for. The private investigator noted that she exited the elevator on the 3rd floor and recorded everything. Instead of following her onto the 3rd floor, he returned to the lobby to wait. About 3 hours later, her boss emerged from the elevator, checked out at the front desk, and walked to his car. The investigator recorded the entire sequence. 10 minutes after that, my wife came down, walked directly to her car, and the investigator caught this on camera too. My suspicions were confirmed. She was having an affair with her bald boss. I finally had the evidence I needed to confront her. The investigator sent me all the photos and videos through Dropbox. I compiled everything into a single 30-minute video and got home early with my laptop and the anonymous letter I had received. If you ask how I felt in that moment, I'd say surprisingly calm because I'd been mentally preparing for this scenario. When she walked through the door, I called her into the kitchen. My laptop sat on the counter, displaying the video of her arriving at the hotel, taking the elevator up, and her boss leaving shortly after, followed by her. As the video played, it only took 2 minutes for her to understand what she was seeing. She looked at me with guilt written all over her face and said, "I can explain." Tears filling her eyes as she kept repeating, "I'm sorry." I cut her off and gestured to the screen, insisting she keep watching. Even as she begged me to stop, trying to explain herself, my anger intensified. I grabbed her by the back of her hair, forcing her to look at the laptop. "Watch it!" I commanded, my voice hard. She sobbed quietly, trembling as she watched, fear clear in her eyes because she had never seen me this enraged. I should note that I'm not a violent person and I had never physically hurt her or any woman before. But that day was an exception. When the video ended, I shoved her, causing her to stumble across the room. The urge to lash out physically was strong, and I screamed at her, accusing her of sleeping with her boss only 5 months into the job. I demanded to know how long this had been happening. Through her tears, she admitted it had been going on for 2 months. She insisted she didn't care about him and that the encounter was meaningless. She couldn't even explain why she did it. I shouted at her to start talking or face the consequences. She broke down and confessed everything, saying she wasn't genuinely attracted to him but wanted him because other women did, as if it were a competition. She explained that since the workplace was mostly women, the fact that he was a male boss seemed to trigger a rivalry. According to her, he was involved with multiple women. I couldn't understand how my wife, who I once saw as beautiful, got tangled up with this man who looked like Gollum. She had ignored the fact that she was married, denying me intimacy while engaging with him just to compete with other women. I was furious beyond words. It felt like my image of her had been permanently ruined. That night, I called her every insulting name I could think of and told her to leave because I couldn't stand the sight of her. She stayed with a friend that night. The evening was incredibly difficult for me. I had to feed and put the kids to bed by myself, and I had no clue where anything was. I ran around in a frenzy, trying not to call her, even though my 5-year-old was crying. She had always been the one to take care of the house and the kids while I worked to provide for the family. I thought we made a good team, but now she'd shattered everything for a pointless competition, forgetting she was married. Her behavior was immature and reckless. She said the other women at work, even the married ones, were throwing themselves at her boss, turning the workplace into a ridiculous contest. I believe one of these women might have sent me that anonymous letter. I couldn't understand why grown women were acting like college girls, competing for the attention of a man who was unattractive and sleazy. The entire situation disgusted me. I wanted a divorce and for her to face the consequences of her betrayal. However, adjusting to life without her wouldn't be easy since I relied on her to manage the home. Since then, my unfaithful wife has been texting and calling, begging to come back home. I barely slept last night, and I still had to work this morning. She knows where everything is, from the kids' supplies to their medications. My 7-year-old has allergies and specific needs that my wife handles well, and my 5-year-old can be challenging to manage. I dropped the kids off at school and left work early to pick them up. Surprisingly, it wasn't as bad as I feared, but I was completely exhausted. I had been ignoring my wife's messages and calls. That evening, I finally called her and told her to come home. To my surprise, she showed up with her older sister, likely because she was afraid to face me alone. Her sister lives 90 miles away, so my wife must have confessed her affair and asked for support. My sister-in-law, who married young and is now divorced, looks so much like my wife that they could be mistaken for twins. However, she's 2 years older, and we've always had a good relationship. Compared to my wife, she is more mature and considerate. My wife had always been the pampered one in her family, and her sister often ended up cleaning up her messes. While I wasn't in the mood to reconcile or be kind to my wife, I welcomed the familiar presence of her sister. Even though I expected her to side with her sibling, I appreciated that she came to mediate, especially since she could relate to my situation, having gone through her own husband's infidelity, which led to their divorce. She pulled me aside and explained she wasn't there for her sister, but for the kids. She acknowledged my wife's immaturity and suggested that for the sake of the children, I should let her stay in the house. She recommended we try an in-house separation to see how things went. I have to admit, she had a way of talking that managed to calm me down enough to tolerate my wife's presence. I glanced at my wife, who was seated in the corner with a flushed face and puffy eyes as if she had been crying for days. Her refusal to meet my gaze gave me some satisfaction, knowing she realized the impact of her betrayal. When the kids came out of their room and greeted her, the atmosphere softened and my heart warmed. I genuinely wished she had remained loyal. Watching her with our children reminded me of how great a mother she was, even if she had failed as a wife. Our apartment had 3 bedrooms, so my wife and her sister took the guest room, while the kids stayed in the 3rd room. After putting the kids to bed, my wife came out and began preparing dinner. I sat in the living room with her sister, watching TV. Her sister chatted with me, clearly trying to distract me from my wife's affair and create a sense of normalcy. Deep down, I longed for things to return to how they once were. I was exhausted from handling the kids and my job alone. Her sister's conversation provided a welcome diversion. While my wife cooked, her sister mentioned that she would leave the next morning unless I needed her to stay longer. I told her I was likely going to file for divorce because I couldn't see my wife the same way or trust her again. She understood and didn't try to change my mind. When my wife finished making dinner, she served us both silently, avoiding eye contact. The following morning, my sister-in-law left, and we went back to our regular routine. I still wasn't speaking to my wife, and she didn't appear to be getting ready for work. I didn't ask why. In the afternoon, I consulted a divorce lawyer to learn about my options. The lawyer explained that based on my wife's income, I might have to pay alimony and child support. It seemed ridiculous because she earned only $45,000 a year, and she had cheated with her boss. Having an affair with a superior while in a committed relationship is unacceptable. Perhaps her new financial independence, thanks to her first job since college, had influenced her decisions, but she had clearly gone too far. It wasn't the money that bothered me, it was the principle. If she could betray me with her first boss, what was to stop her from doing the same with another authority figure? That evening, when I got home, I spoke to my wife for the first time since everything fell apart. She handed me a letter she wanted to read aloud. She explained that writing it allowed her to share her thoughts without breaking down emotionally. As she read the letter, she repeatedly apologized, saying she was sorry for betraying my trust and acting immaturely. Notably, she avoided mentioning her boss. She expressed a desire to save our marriage and promised to do whatever it took to make things right. Then she said something that completely surprised me. She told me I could sleep with other women if I wanted to. Her statement shocked me because she had always been possessive. I didn't believe she was sincere. I told her I didn't need her permission to be with other women since she had forfeited any right to an opinion on the matter. I saw her offer as an attempt to manipulate me and lessen her guilt. Before she could continue, I cut her off and clarified that I had no desire to be with other women, and if I did, I wouldn't have married her to begin with. This caused her to break down in tears, but I insisted she still hadn't explained why she lied to me for 2 months. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was calculated and intentional. She planned to meet at the hotel and have a clandestine affair with that repulsive man, risking everything for what? I told her we were getting a divorce and that my decision was final. I added that even though she was physically attractive, the thought of being intimate with her or having her close made me sick. She kept asking, "Why are you being so cruel to me?" Throughout our marriage, I had treated her like a queen. I never raised my voice, spoiled her, let her set the rules at home, and gave her full control over the household. She had grown used to that treatment. I treated her kindly and never once mistreated her, so maybe she thought she could cheat with her boss, and I'd still be the same forgiving husband. It was hard to believe. Then she told me she had quit her job because she couldn't bear to see her former boss anymore. She said she had everything with me, but threw it away to fit in with her coworkers. She claimed she didn't even know how things escalated to sex. As much as I hated thinking about her boss, I couldn't stop wondering how a man who looked like Gollum could attract my wife and make her forget her marriage vows. I kept asking her why she got involved with him. She fumbled to explain, admitting she was also trying to understand how she ended up in that situation and why she continued it. She insisted it wasn't because the sex was good and sarcastically added it certainly wasn't because of his looks. The only explanation she gave was that he was persuasive, always knowing the right thing to say. His position as a supervisor added to his appeal, especially since the women at work admired him and competed for his attention. Although her reasoning was detailed, all I could think about was how much I wanted to ruin this Gollum's life. I told her I planned to expose him. At this point, my wife was willing to do anything to appease me, even though we were headed for a divorce. She said she couldn't stand seeing me angry with her. I told her I wanted to expose her boss to his wife. Although she had been foolish to let this man use her, he deserved to face the consequences for wrecking our family. She gave me his address and his wife's name. When I asked how they communicated without texting, she admitted they used her work email messenger. I demanded she log in and show me the messages, but she hesitated, saying it would only upset me further. She also feared I might hurt her if I saw them. I pushed her, but she insisted that since we were divorcing, she would show me the messages once it was finalized. A few days later, I tracked down Gollum's wife. For context, he was 51 and she was 48. I ran a background check and found his home address. He had 4 children, the youngest being 12. I copied the video evidence onto a thumb drive and headed to his house knowing he was still at work, likely with another employee. I knocked on the door and his wife answered. It seemed she was home alone. I explained the situation and handed her the flash drive with the evidence and the anonymous letter I had received. She confessed that she had gotten a similar letter and confronted her husband, but he denied everything. He had convinced her that the women at work were lazy and out to ruin him because he demanded they do their jobs. She believed his story and never considered hiring a private investigator or suspecting anything was wrong. She thanked me for the information and for my military service, and we exchanged contact details before saying goodbye. I don't know if they divorced, but at least she now knew the truth about him. Last week, I gave all the evidence to HR. I spoke to a woman on the phone who asked me to come in person. During the visit, I handed over another flash drive containing the proof and a statement from my wife admitting her affair was why she quit. I figured this would be enough to get him fired. Before I left, I decided to confront Gollum. After exiting the HR office, I walked to the loading dock where semi-trucks are unloaded. The area wasn't secure and a side door was unlocked, allowing me to slip inside. Although, I wasn't familiar with the layout of the building, but I knew Gollum's name, so I asked an employee who pointed me toward his office. As I walked through the warehouse, I noticed that most of the workers were women, even those operating forklifts. It seemed like the company leaned heavily toward hiring female employees, though a few male workers were scattered around. As I neared his office, I spotted Gollum coming out of one of the rooms. I was about 50 feet away when I called his name. He turned, trying to figure out who I was, probably assuming I was a truck driver making a delivery. When I got close enough to face him, I didn't say a word. Instead, I landed a solid right hook, knocking him out with one punch. I calmly left the warehouse, and as I reached the exit, I glanced back to see a small group gathering around him as he started to regain consciousness. I then stepped outside and left the building. Yesterday, shortly after I got home from work, there was a knock on my door. 2 police officers stood there, wanting to question me about the assault at my wife's previous workplace. They suspected I was involved, but didn't have hard evidence. Their questions made it clear that I was a prime suspect. Though the security cameras had captured someone, the footage wasn't clear, possibly because I wore a hat. In short, Gollum had accused me and wanted to press charges. The police asked if I had an alibi, and I told them I was home with my wife. They requested to speak with her, and she backed up my story even though she hadn't known about the assault beforehand. She quickly caught on and supported my false alibi. I'm not sure if the police believed us, but they took pictures of our cars, noted my contact details, and said they'd reach out if they had more questions. I realized I had messed up, and it was hard to believe that the man who slept with my wife had the nerve to report me to the police. Fortunately, word spread quickly, and one of the women he had been involved with filed a sexual harassment complaint against him. This likely happened because of the HR investigation and my confrontation at his workplace. During the HR investigation, many women confessed the truth. It turned out that Gollum had pressured several female employees into inappropriate situations. Some initially resisted, while others complied out of fear or coercion. The situation was complicated, similar to the Harvey Weinstein case, where some women went along with it to advance their careers, but later claimed victimhood once legal action began. Regardless, I was relieved with the outcome. I heard that he was fired the next day. My wife stayed in touch with some of her colleagues, so while I wasn't sure if this was completely accurate, it seemed likely. A few days later, I contacted Gollum's wife to check on her. She told me they were now separated and that he had moved out. She also shared that multiple women had filed sexual harassment complaints against him. After confronting him with the evidence I gave her, he admitted to only having an affair with my wife. But with several women now accusing him, I found his claim hard to believe. This didn't give me any comfort. In fact, I would feel slightly better if it turned out he had been with multiple women instead of just my wife. It left me wondering what my wife had gained from this affair and questioning my judgment for marrying her. If she could be so easily swayed, what did that say about her loyalty during my military deployments? Writing this now, I feel overwhelmed with sadness and despair. I've been reading countless posts about overcoming infidelity, trying to find some reassurance that I'm not alone. I also spoke to my brother on the phone, and he suggested I see a therapist to help me cope. The VA covers therapy costs, so it wouldn't be a financial burden. Still, I feel hesitant and uneasy about sharing my issues with a stranger, even a professional. Yet, here I am sharing my story with strangers online, which oddly feels therapeutic. Currently, I'm still living in the same house with my unfaithful wife, though we stay in separate rooms. Her sister has been visiting more often, and things seem to be returning to a semblance of normalcy. My wife is doing everything she can to please me. Despite this, we haven't been intimate since the day I found out, and I have no desire for it. I keep putting off the divorce, realizing the more time passes, the more I grow used to her filling the roles of wife and mother again. At first, I thought my wife was inviting her sister to help us reconnect, since she knows I get along well with her. However, it turns out her sister is considering moving closer to us. With her children almost grown and her youngest preparing for college, she's looking to relocate near us. We have a lot of family nearby, including my parents, who know the situation. Our marriage has been going through a rough patch since my wife's affair, though my parents don't know all the details. Despite her betrayal, they still hope we can reconcile for the sake of the children. A few weeks later, my sister-in-law found a new job near us and moved to the area. My wife and I continued living in the same house, but we stayed in separate bedrooms. We essentially became roommates, and I repeatedly rejected my wife's attempts to be intimate. Although going without sex for a long time is tough, my military background taught me discipline. My sister-in-law started visiting more frequently, and it seemed she was more interested in spending time with me than with her sister or the kids. My wife noticed this and confronted her. I learned about their conversation later when my sister-in-law started visiting less often, without giving an explanation. Since my wife has always been jealous, her reaction didn't surprise me. In hindsight, it might have been for the best because I was beginning to feel drawn to my sister-in-law. Although I'd always found her attractive, I never acted on those feelings because I was married to her younger sister. I was debating whether to give my wife another chance or proceed with a divorce. However, I found myself leaning more toward divorce. Rebuilding trust seemed impossible, and I couldn't imagine sharing a bed with someone I no longer trusted. Her 2-month affair, combined with rejecting me during that period, felt unforgivable. My wife believed we could repair our relationship and made noticeable efforts to seduce me. She started wearing revealing lace nightgowns around the house, often without underwear. I knew she was trying to win me over, and unfortunately, she was well aware of my weaknesses. One evening, I gave in. I was grabbing something from the fridge, possibly a beer, and as I passed by, I saw her leaning against the kitchen counter, preparing snacks for the kids. She wore a sheer lace robe without any underwear beneath it. Earlier, she had been walking around in the same outfit, which had already stirred my desire. As she leaned forward, her back to me, I couldn't resist. I placed my hands on her hips, pulled her closer, and guided her into a standing doggy position. I lifted the robe, and things escalated from there. It turned out to be the most intense encounter we'd ever had. Unlike our usual slow and tender lovemaking, this was raw and fueled by my pent-up frustration. She climaxed faster and responded more intensely than ever before. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but her reaction seemed completely different from anything I'd seen in our decade together. We always had gentle, romantic intimacy, never anything rough or passionate. We only stopped because she got too loud, and the kids started to come out of their rooms. I was still dazed when they interrupted, and instead of suggesting we move to the bedroom, I went to the bathroom to finish alone. That night's brief encounter revealed something about my wife that shocked me. I discovered she liked rough and assertive intimacy, something I hadn't known. This realization was surprising because I thought I knew everything about her. Before meeting her, I had little experience with women, and throughout our marriage, I stayed loyal. It felt like I had married someone I didn't really know. In our usual encounters, I let her lead, always focused on pleasing her. I read books on satisfying a woman, which stressed paying attention to her body's signals. Even Bernie Mac joked about this in a comedy skit. I now felt like our marriage had been based on conventional intimacy, which may not have been what she truly wanted. That night, I took control and ignored her cues, and she reacted positively, reaching climax quickly. What disturbed me most was the thought that I didn't know her as well as I believed. I questioned whether her affair was my fault. Maybe if I had been more assertive and dominant, she wouldn't have strayed. Perhaps this was what she wanted all along, and I had missed the signs. It made me feel that all the marriage advice I'd followed was wrong or didn't apply to her. Her response to my dominance made me think she desired someone who took charge. I had always been taught to be kind and respectful with my wife, likely following the same advice my priest would give. Now I wondered if her infidelity stemmed from my failure to recognize her needs. I wished I had someone to talk to about this, but I didn't know where to turn. Outwardly, I might seem like a tough, combat-trained military man, but with my wife, I was soft and gentle, letting her run the household and manage our finances. It's clear to me now that giving up my authority in the marriage, both at home and in the bedroom, led to this situation. Recognizing these mistakes is important so I don't repeat them in future relationships. Though the spontaneous encounter with my unfaithful wife was a mistake, it gave me insight into our relationship. I now believe that because I failed to assert myself, she sought someone who would take control. I couldn't shake the thought that this might not have been her first experience like this. Some people have suggested I get tested for STDs and conduct paternity tests for my children, which seems like a reasonable idea. Luckily, my kids look a lot like me. I find it hard to believe that my children aren't mine. I used to be sure that my wife stayed faithful while I was serving in the military, but now I'm not so certain. These past few weeks have shown me that there's a lot I didn't know. If I hadn't received that letter exposing her affair, she might still be sneaking around with Gollum today. I can't help but wonder if his dominance was a factor in her ongoing attraction to him. Yesterday, I took an STD test, and thankfully, the results were negative. I also decided to follow the advice of many of you and proceeded with a paternity test. I secretly collected saliva samples from our 3 children without informing my unfaithful wife. The paternity results will arrive in about 4 weeks. I'm not too worried about the outcome because I believe the children are mine. Their conception lines up with the times I was home during my military service. We lived in on-base housing reserved for married service members. As for an update, there isn't much new to report. I'm still considering divorce, and my lawyer has drafted the separation agreement. It seems I'll have to pay alimony, which won't be very different from the financial support I've already been giving her since she was a stay-at-home mom. We're civil to each other, but we sleep in separate rooms, effectively living as roommates. We haven't been intimate since that unexpected encounter in the kitchen. She's been trying to win me over, but I avoid her by staying out late with friends after work, and sometimes not coming home at all. She often calls to ask where I am, but I ignore her. She's aware that I've become emotionally detached and suspects I've mentally checked out of our marriage. I should have filed for divorce weeks ago, but I've been hesitant due to my dislike for change. I'm also worried about balancing my demanding job with shared custody. When we separate, I plan to pursue a 70/30th custody arrangement so I can spend as much time as possible with the kids. I love my children dearly and treasure our moments together. They often prefer my company because I'm more lenient, buying them gifts, while my wife plays the role of disciplinarian. Sometimes I hide these gifts to avoid her disapproval, though she usually finds them. I'm the main provider while she has managed the household, a setup that worked for me. The police haven't followed up on the assault investigation, and I hope it stays that way. I heard that a civil suit was filed against Gollum, but I'm unsure if he's been arrested. Apparently, none of the women he harassed reported him to HR before my confrontation. Maybe they thought no one would listen. My confrontation with him seems to have given them the courage to speak up. Yesterday, I got the paternity test results, confirming that all 3 children are mine. I'm relieved. As I mentioned earlier, I plan to go through with the divorce. I told my wife in advance that I'd be filing the papers, and she cried, but she accepted that there was no going back. Despite the humiliation and pain she caused, I genuinely wish her well. She's still an attractive woman, and I'm sure she'll find someone new. But for us, the journey is over. Before serving the papers, we discussed her future plans. She mentioned looking for a part-time teaching job to keep busy. We agreed that I'd give her $3,000 a month, which covers both her allowance and child support. I know some people think involving the legal system is smarter, but I'm wary of extra government interference in my finances. In the end, we finalized the divorce with our lawyers. The process was amicable. I don't hold a grudge, and she accepted responsibility for her actions. I've forgiven her for the sake of the kids, but I'll never trust her again or consider reconciliation. I recently rented a nice 2-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood. There are a lot of attractive women around, and since I never dated anyone else besides my wife, it's a new experience for me. Asking women out isn't easy because I never learned how to date, but I'm confident in my appearance, and women do check me out occasionally, so I feel optimistic. On another note, my sister-in-law has been visiting my apartment more frequently now that I no longer live with my ex-wife. It's clear she's attracted to me, and we've been spending more time together. I'm not sure where this is going, but I'm not interested in dating her, and I think she realizes that. Despite this, we both enjoy each other's company.